Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be doing an in-depth design comparison between Pikmin 3 and StarCraft II. If you're anything like me, these are probably the last two games you'd expect to see compared from a game design perspective. Pikmin is a part management simulator, part puzzle game, intended to appeal to all ages, inspired by the gardening experiences of its creator, Shigeru Miyamoto. StarCraft is a popular multiplayer real-time strategy game, appealing to many different types of players, but most famous for its ruthlessly competitive professional scene. What could these two games possibly have in common? You can imagine my surprise when I went online and discovered that Pikmin is classified as a real-time strategy game. After some thought, I realized that this kinda makes sense. It runs in real time, it definitely has a strategy component, and it even features a top-down view. But I was still dissatisfied. I wanted to dig deeper and really understand what real-time strategy means when applied to games that provide completely different player experiences. Well, first, why would we want to do that? Real-time strategy is just a label. What value do we get out of analyzing it in depth? Well, a genre is a collection of features. Comparisons between different games within a genre can help us understand why those features exist. The limited weapon selection in Counter-Strike can feel like a lack of content when viewed on its own, but when compared with the more prescriptive designs of Battlefield, we start to see it as a key enabler of individual creativity. Sometimes, just classifying a game can give us insight into why it works the way it does. One of the best ways to understand the design of Borderlands is to play Diablo. By the same token, one of the best ways to understand the weaknesses of the pre-sequel is to look at the design criticisms of Diablo 3. We can learn a lot about how Pikmin works by looking at StarCraft, and as surprising as it may be, the reverse is true as well. One of the issues players frequently raise about traditional real-time strategy games like StarCraft is their mechanical demand, the need to constantly queue new units, build up your economy, manage your army, and so on. Now naturally a game like Pikmin has nowhere near the mechanical demands of competitive StarCraft, but if we look at its mechanics in detail, we'll see that it features the same design philosophy. The idea that players are willing to engage with mechanically intense gameplay if it's sufficiently deep and satisfying. Rock Pikmin are a great example. They'll complete the task in front of them when left to their own devices, but they're vastly more effective when closely micromanaged and continuously rethrown. The implementation here is really well done. The satisfying crack of hitting a piece of glass, the shards flashing away as the Pikmin strike its target. It's surprisingly visceral, and ensures rock Pikmin are fun to control even after dozens of hours of playtime. The player is never prevented from taking the more passive approach, but the experience is clearly balanced around the assumption that players would prefer to be actively involved. The evidence for this is everywhere. Virtually every interaction in the game is made better by the player's active and focused participation. Smaller enemies can be one-shot by players with accurate control. Environmental hazards like water can be worked around by good players. Whether a location is reachable is often a function of how the player throws their Pikmin rather than some intrinsic quality to the Pikmin themselves. Both the story and cooperative modes reward frantic multitasking. In fact, some of the cooperative missions cannot even be completed without at least one player constantly switching from character to character. My point is that Pikmin is not a ruthless electronic sport. In fact, it's probably one of the most casual real-time strategy games on the market, yet it still features a ton of mechanical depth. Many people might find that surprising, but it makes perfect sense. One of the ideas that I often bring up is the notion that the target audience of a game enjoys the core mechanics of that game. Players who play shooters enjoy shooting mechanics, players who play role-playing games like fiddling with their stats and equipment, and so on. Pikmin helps us see this with respect to the real-time strategy genre. Players who enjoy RTS games will see these micro-intense features as an opportunity. Rock Pikmin get the job done on their own, but with proper control they can be exponentially more effective. Players who don't enjoy RTS games will probably see them as a problem. Rock Pikmin are ineffective unless the player is willing to engage in a quote-unquote clickfest. It's a matter of perspective and personal taste rather than a statement on the genre. Pikmin also gives us a unique insight into the real-time nature of real-time strategy games. Strategy games were traditionally turn-based, meaning the game state could only be changed by one player at a time. Real-time strategy games change this dynamic by allowing any player to affect the game state at any time. It's actually worth pointing out that this is more an ideal than an actual reality. Game engines process actions at a fixed rate, 16 times a second in the case of StarCraft II. Technically, from this perspective, StarCraft is more simultaneous turn-based than true real-time. If you look at the time to first action data for top professional players, the reaction times tend to converge. At a certain point, some players might be faster than others, but if the difference is less than what the engine can process, it won't show up in-game. In the case of StarCraft, that's about 50 milliseconds, a reasonably long period in the realm of human reaction time. Pikmin's exotic environments make me consider how a hypothetical alien with zero reaction time would experience real-time strategy games. With their ability to physically perceive turns, would they see the label as erroneous? Will future humans with hypothetical physical enhancements be unable to play these games, frustrated by a game engine they perceive as slow and not reflective of reality? None of this is particularly relevant, but it's the kind of stuff that I think about when I make these videos. Back to StarCraft and Pikmin. The impact of the real-time mechanic on player experience isn't fixed. It depends a lot on how it's implemented. In Pikmin, the story mode is single-player and the game world is essentially static. The importance of the game's real-time mechanic, in other words, the value in being able to go faster or slower at any given time, is conveyed through a timer and limited food supply, both of which act as forcing functions to set the pacing of the game and push the player forward. Players need to make the most of each day to ensure that they're making progress, solving enough puzzles and retrieving enough fruit to sustain their mission. In other words, real-time is a source of tension, a pressure point on the player to be as efficient as possible to ensure their own survival. This is an entirely different perspective from how I've always engaged with traditional real-time strategy games. In titles like StarCraft, real-time is an opportunity, a source of dynamism and excitement. You can skillfully exploit sharp timings or simply use your time and attention more efficiently than your opponent. Real-time is a good thing, not a source of tension. In fact, Pikmin's concept of being on a timer is often used as an epithet in the StarCraft community. The idea there is that players shouldn't lose simply because they didn't win fast enough. But if we really think about it, StarCraft and Pikmin are not so different. Regardless of the game mode, players in StarCraft will eventually lose if they take no action. Do nothing in a ladder game and your time will eventually run out, even in Bronze League. Most cooperative and campaign missions feature a win condition that's time dependent. Even the basic mechanics of the game are finite. On standard maps, there's a limited number of resources that can be mined in a single game. But all this sounds kinda strange, doesn't it? This stuff might be technically true, but it's not how most players experience StarCraft. That's because the way the developers implemented the real-time mechanic pushes the player to focus on their own actions and internalize their locus of control. Players are encouraged to think about their own play and their own decisions, not the state of the outside game world. It didn't have to be this way. For instance, contrast StarCraft's technology tree with Age of Empires. The latter series publicly announced any time a player aged up. Timings around age advancements provided critical strategic information about what a player was planning. At the highest levels, players could tell exactly what you were doing based purely on a 30-second difference in your age-up time. It wasn't until I played Pikmin that I started to view this as an unnecessary source of tension. StarCraft has a tech tree too, but it doesn't announce what players are doing. It's the player's responsibility to individually care enough about what their opponent is doing to go off and actually scout them. The game doesn't unnecessarily externalize the player's focus. Pikmin does, and that's because the game's developers are trying to accomplish something different with a real-time mechanic. This also says something to me about the target audience of these games. Speaking personally, the timer and food supply mechanics in Pikmin had almost no impact on my approach to the game. They're so comically easy to fulfill that at times I wondered why they even existed. I had to remind myself that Pikmin, like many Nintendo games, includes small children in its target audience. Kids aren't particularly adept at setting their own direction in a game and finding a pacing that's comfortable for them. They need the game itself to push them forward, or else they'll start to feel confused as to what they're supposed to do. By contrast, StarCraft is definitely playable by kids, but its intended player base is clearly older than Pikmin's. This means it trusts players with the internal locus of control that I mentioned earlier. Getting overwhelmed in the campaign, or losing to a rush on the competitive ladder, is a signal that a player needs to respond with stronger build orders or more efficient execution. But the game never tells you that, because it wants to give you the freedom to respond in a way that makes sense to you. Maybe one player wants to repeat what they just did but with better execution, whereas another thinks a strategic adjustment is what's needed. The type of child who would enjoy Pikmin might perceive this kind of situation as fundamentally unfair. They're too young to set their own direction, and yet they need to in order to make progress. What's interesting is that this difference in target audience design isn't always consistent. Take a look at how the Wings of Liberty campaign introduces the siege tank.
These new siege tanks work just like the old ones. When you put them in siege mode, they get increased range and firepower. They can't move in siege mode, so if you need to reposition them, just switch them back into tank mode. You got it? What's that?
Now, I imagine that if you sat down with Blizzard's game design staff and asked them whether StarCraft was designed for people who struggle with the concept of a tank that can enter siege mode, they'd laugh you out of the room. But I'd also bet that if you showed them this particular sequence, they'd have no issue with it. It's a minor accessibility concession that tries to broaden the game's audience. While I understand the logic, this kind of stuff still manages to take me out of the experience. It's hard for me to get immersed in the game's story when it's beating me over the head with mind-numbing explanations. This is one of the reasons I really prefer the Nova DLC to the mainline campaigns. It felt like the developers finally felt comfortable building missions for the game's core audience rather than trying to appeal to everyone. There was a lot more depth in the gameplay and complexity in the tech choices. Anecdotally, I also got the impression that there was more rigorous playtesting done around the brutal difficulty mode. Pikmin, for its part, is one of the most prescriptive Nintendo games I've played, but it still prefers to show rather than tell when possible. I'd say narrative immersion was a stronger goal relative to StarCraft, so I think this was the right approach. Let's move on to the strategy aspect of each game. It's here where we start to see the clearest differences in design philosophy between the two titles. One of the reasons I originally found the RTS label so surprising in Pikmin was the lack of strategy that the game requires. For instance, consider the sequence in front of you. The player needs to intelligently balance the positions of their units in order to reach a large piece of fruit. It's surprisingly complicated and easy to mess up. Personally, I spent an entire in-game day on it. Once it's done, it feels really satisfying, like you figured out something hard and as a result you get to collect a valuable prize. But it's important to call this what it is, a puzzle. Every player who solves this sequence will solve it exactly the same way. This is in stark contrast to the concept of strategy, the sense of risk and reward, the need for judgment, the inclusion of personal style and individual creativity. None of that can exist if there's only one right answer that everyone needs to follow. Now again, the difference between puzzle and strategy might seem like a minor semantic point, but it's actually really important because of how it impacts reward systems. The source of satisfaction in Pikmin is ultimately the game designer. This puzzle is satisfying to complete because the designer made it so. It's because someone sat down and put something together that's enjoyable to solve. In other words, Pikmin is fun because a designer designed it to be fun. That might sound like a tautology, but the truth is that not all games work this way, and StarCraft is a great example. The hallmark of a well-designed strategy game is the existence of multiple viable approaches to the same situation. The game is an environment, an arena, a facilitator. The sense of satisfaction and achievement comes from the player and how they choose to approach the game, what they decide to do, what they decide to work on, and the results of that effort. The player has a lot more ownership in the experience because what defines the right decision is closely tied to who's playing, and not necessarily what the game prescribes. Another way of looking at this is to say that the player needs to take ownership. In a game like Pikmin, as long as you figure out what the designer wants you to do, you get to experience what the designer built into the game. The result is a fun and satisfying experience. That's just not the case in StarCraft's competitive ladder, or in many cases even its campaign mode. There are good and bad responses to getting baneling busted or cannon rushed, but the player is responsible for figuring that out. In other words, the satisfaction and achievement to be found in this situation depend on the player, not the designer. All the designer does is make lots of different and interesting situations viable. Most of the value to be found within them comes from the players. If the player doesn't understand that the experience is fundamentally driven by them, then they might feel confused or struggle to have fun. It's kind of astonishing to me that a game with so much strategic depth like StarCraft so often gets criticized for not having enough strategic depth. I think the reason this happens is because the game doesn't define the strategies for you. It doesn't take ownership for the feeling of strategic satisfaction. It's up to players to figure out what's satisfying to them, given their particular circumstances and skill sets. I have a strong suspicion that the people who crave a quote-unquote more strategic real-time strategy game would actually find the experience they're looking for in Pikmin. In other words, I think the problem is less about strategy and more about who owns and drives the sense of strategic satisfaction, the player or the designer. Viewed from this perspective, it's actually kind of hard to call Pikmin a real-time strategy game. Real-time puzzle game would arguably be more accurate. The cooperative mode is the saving grace here, featuring gameplay that's a lot less fixed and more malleable to individual style. Alright, switching gears a bit, I think now is a good time to discuss the plot of these two titles. I mentioned earlier that I sometimes struggled to engage with the campaigns of real-time strategy games. One of the reasons for that is that this genre, more than many others, always seems to generate the same, very specific plot. Some kind of epic war with epic generals and epic battles. StarCraft is no different. The problem is that anyone who plays competitively will naturally start to see the game's components like pieces on a chessboard. Chess is many things, but it's usually not considered a strong narrative experience. Pikmin works differently. At its core, it's really just a story about wonder and discovery. The designers never allow the genre to force the plot in a particular direction. It's always the other way around. That's because, in contrast with how I imagine most real-time strategy games are built, the game's core concepts came first and the genre was selected second. Here's Shigeru Miyamoto describing how he came up with the idea. Ants, as you know, always have a leader and tend to be carrying things, and as they move, they create a kind of rail. And I started thinking about a game about lots of small people carrying things in a line, following a leader, with everyone going in the same direction. Pikmin avoids repeating a tired concept because its concept was original to begin with. The rest of the game was built around it. Now, I understand that there's a lot of people out there who really love StarCraft's narrative, so I want to emphasize that this isn't a criticism of that game. The fact that it uses the same structure as many other titles doesn't mean that the structure is inherently bad. My core point is the difference in cause and effect. Blizzard's Mike Morhaime, in a 2008 interview, described the company's process in highly mechanical terms, picking a genre first before settling on higher level items like franchise or setting. Miyamoto obviously approached the problem differently, and I think that's what enabled Pikmin to drive such a unique plot. And there you have it. Pikmin and StarCraft are surprisingly interesting games to compare and contrast, despite how different they seem on the surface level. Pikmin helps us understand why StarCraft's mechanical depth is so important. In turn, StarCraft shows us why Pikmin's real-time component can be so nerve-wracking. I think these games can learn a lot from each other. At the very least, we as players can learn more about why we love the games that we do. If you're a fan of either of these titles, I'd encourage you to check out the other. You might be surprised with how much you end up liking it. Alright, that mostly covers the things that I wanted to talk about. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please consider following me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.